Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for coming. I'm Lisa Fox Martin. I'm the chair of the board, and on behalf of all our wonderful trustees, we welcome you today on this beautiful spring day at the opening of another really exciting season. So I have the great pleasure of introducing Betsy Jacks, our executive director, who will then give a full, wonderful introduction of our fabulous, fabulous speaker and curator today. So thank you so much for coming, and I know you will enjoy this afternoon.
Hello, everybody. How many of you have been into a lecture in this space before? Do you remember some old stalwarts? Here we are. It's been a while. Now, since we built the new studio, we haven't had a lecture in here. So I'm Betsy Jacks, Executive Director of the Thomas Cole site, and welcome. Thomas Cole said that nothing in his paintings is accidental. So the last 20 years, I've been staring at them, trying to figure out what he meant. What are all these details? And in nearly every painting, if you draw a big X, art historians like to do that, corner to corner, big X, right in the center, nearly always, is an Indigenous figure. So what is that all about? Our speaker today showed me just how narrow that question was and opened my eyes to a whole new way of seeing nature, a new way of seeing the valley we live in, and a very hopeful new way that people can learn to live together. So today, with tremendous gratitude, we are learning and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican, the people of the waters that are never still, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Today, their community resides in Wisconsin and are known as the Stockbridge-Muncie community. Before I introduce our incredible speaker, I would like to also thank all of the organizations that made this project possible. The project being the exhibition, our overall Indigenous initiative. It's garnered a lot of support, and it's gonna need a lot more because we have a lot more way to go. The Terra Foundation for American Art, the Warner Foundation, the Bay and Paul Foundations, the Cranshaw Foundation, Cranshaw Corporation, National Endowment for the Arts, the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, the New York State Council on the Arts, and the list goes on. Dr. Stevens, Dr. Scott Manning Stevens, our speaker today, is a citizen of the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation, holds a PhD and master's degree from Harvard University, and he is a highly sought-after educator, author, and he has taught at a number of universities, including Harvard, the Arizona State, and SUNY Buffalo. He was awarded a Ford, it's very dark here, a Ford postdoctoral fellowship at Brown University, and holds a number of fellowships at major archives. He's lectured broadly throughout the United States and internationally. We are very hard to get this guy. He earned an AB in English from Dartmouth, a PhD from Harvard. He's been awarded the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Newberry Library, the Fulbright Scholarship Program. You get the idea, I could go on and on. But I think that his, in my humble opinion, the most tremendous gift that he brings to us is that eye-opening experience to realize the world is so much bigger than you thought it was and has room for so many more people than you thought it did. So please welcome Dr. Stevens.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. So, Sego Skanagoa, Karoniaktatsie Yonkiats. That's a Mohawk greeting. Sego Skanagoa means I hope it is still the great peace with you. and Scano piece is at the center of our ethical world as Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people. Scano is not just the absence of war or violence, but it's balance, it's respect, and it's harmony. And you hope that everyone is part of the great Scano, the Scano Goa, which is to be at peace with your neighbors, with your family, with yourself, with your environment. And I come here with those hopes as we talk about these issues today. And I'm delighted to be in Mohican homelands. It's such a beautiful place. I always love coming here. And this is a very special place in that homeland. So I want to thank the people I've worked with, Kate and Amanda primarily, for just helping, for first of all inviting me to think of putting something together here and helping me every step of the way to bring the show together. It's some very far-flung pieces, and you know, one of the parts we never think about when we imagine putting an exhibit together is the tedious the logistics of it, and the borrowing, the insurance, the travel, the delivery, the unpacking. And everyone here has had a hand in that. I want to say, you know, great thank you. So what is it that I really wanted to do with this exhibit, and hopefully people will take away with them? And some of you have heard me talk about this before. I lectured here once after things reopened after COVID and talked about landscape painting from an Indigenous perspective. And sometimes people are surprised to hear that a lot of Native American people and other people of color are not really very fond of the American landscape tradition, which just seems to be about beauty and the celebration of nature. Who could be about that? Against that, you know, what's the problem? But the problem is that there's a kind of mythologizing that goes on in these relatively innocent looking paintings. And it doesn't create a problem, but it plays into a dangerous pattern of problems that mark American settler colonialism. One is you have these, you know, tiny figures of Native people in many of Cole's works. They don't seem to be part of a story. They're not part of a narrative. And the old-fashioned art history term for such figures, whether they're native or farmers or peasants in a pretty landscape, is staffage. They're staff. And they are there to show you scale, right? How big are those things near them? There's the human scale. And they're there when they're noticeably Native American, usually because they're sporting a feather on their head. And that's it, you know, feather, Indian. That's all we have. There's nothing ethnographically specific about them. You're not learning about their culture, their tribe, anything like that. But that's for location. So size, scale, and location, because some of these, given the picturesque traditions of Europe, could as easily be on the Rhine River as they are on the Hudson. But when you throw a native person there, put a feather on his head, then presto changeo, America. Yeah. That tradition, you know, carries on to the people that are influenced by Cole, like Church, like people like Gifford. In Gifford's, I would need a big magnifying glass to show you that there's a tiny, is there a pointer on this or no? I think not. There's a tiny native group huddled against this oncoming storm. And that's also a part of a tradition of putting Native people in sunsets and in storms. Something's coming, something not good. And that other most, you know, pernicious myth that these paintings partake in and bolster is the myth of the vanishing Indian. We're just melting away. No violence, no warfare scenes, simply solitary people in foreboding landscapes. And that vanishing aspect, again, as I've said many times, I've said here and I've said to my class many times, that verb vanishing is a very nasty one, because who is the agent of that vanishing? Makes it sound like Native people are doing it, like it's a trick we've got up our sleeves. But I ask, who vanished the Indians? If our populations are decreasing to the point of demographic collapse because of war, because of dispossession, because of disease, that's not vanishing, right? That's an ethnocide, in some cases a genocide. And so you have, on top of the vanishing Indian, the other trope of the period, going back to someone like Cole, was his love of the romantic sublime, right? He is painting at a time when sublimity of nature was being celebrated, which isn't in of itself a bad thing. But it demands, in his case, a wilderness. And that is a term we simply do not have in native languages. And there are hundreds of native languages. We don't have the concept of a part of nature that humans don't live in, that is free from us. We have rural, we have forest in any of those situations. And Joseph Brant in the 18th century starts translating the Gospel of Mark, a voice crying in the wilderness. His first sticking point is with the word wilderness. We do not have a ready-made word for that, which is a conceptual category. The Puritans' errand into the wilderness, that place hostile to God, to God's providence and everything else, that they would have to tame. And so we are either erased by the claim of wilderness or demoted to a less than human perspective. At one point, Cole says, some of the Indians are as wild as the wilderness. You get the point, right? That for us to be either blanked, and they say no one lives there, where you wouldn't know anyone lives there if you just see solitary figures. You don't see villages, you don't see any structures, you don't see communities, you don't see a future. You see a solitary person. And again, atmospherically, when they're at sunset, the writing is on the wall. They're going down with that setting sun, and it's been naturalized for you as though it's as normal as the setting of the sun. And that's the danger. To let it just wash over you passively, to enjoy its beauty, to wave a fond goodbye. You know, an elegy is a type of poem that celebrates and mourns the death of someone, and there's an elegiac tone to a lot of this work. But there's a sweetness in that saying goodbye, which I think we shouldn't find too delectable, right? There's also a reassurance for a lot of settlers that Native people were disappearing. And what would be left behind? This wonderful wilderness. You know, I have a friend of mine who particularly dislikes church because he doesn't even bother to put Native people in this thing. He said it's just like ringing a dinner bell for Manifest Destiny. There it is, boys, come and get it. It's ready, it's beautiful, and it's waiting to be populated. Well, it is populated. And so my interest was thinking, well, what do we as Native people, do traditionally? How have we regarded the landscape? We don't have this realistic notion of representative art that, highly dramatized with the use of light. I mean, these are all beautiful, skillfully made paintings. As I warn my students, do not think of them as documentary evidence of a time in the past, because they're highly mediated by the artists that paint them and highly curated. if you know some of both Church and Cole's paintings of, say, there's one in the show right now of a mountain, a solitary lake in New Hampshire. That mountain is nowhere to be found in the White Mountains. It is a jagged peak like, Eiger or Jungfrau in the Bernese Alps. It is not from here. I'd like to see some of those, and even Bierstadt finds the Rockies not high enough, right? And, but you can see it's like paradise. It is waiting for us. It might be an angel at the end of that glow, and it is calling us to take it. But I was thinking of, what about Native artists, contemporary Native artists, traditional artists, both? What did we do in the past? Certainly we loved and celebrated not just the earth and living on it, but we loved what we saw around us. Who doesn't stand at a prospect and look out over the Hudson and not love it? And they weren't just thinking, oh, this is the earth, I have to tend to it. We thought those things because that's how we live with the earth. But there's beauty there. And it shouldn't be something that Native painters today are afraid to paint because, oh, I don't want to be part of the landscape tradition. And I remember Kay Walking Stick very graciously accepting a cold call from me. I found out where she was, how to contact her. And first I wrote her an email saying I would like to talk to her and vaguely what I was doing. And she nicely said, the only reason I answered it is it said, hello from Syracuse. And she said, I'm from Syracuse originally. So thank God for local connections. And we spoke on the phone for over an hour and about this issue of landscape, because I loved her landscapes. And she's been painting for a long time. And I said, I'm glad that you paint landscapes because a lot of people feel Native people should avoid it. And she said, I'm not going to be told we can't paint the land that we love. It's kind of a reappropriation on her part. It's an intervention into a tradition and a reappropriation from an Indigenous standpoint. And they are both beautiful and can be politically searing. I mean, those ghost-like figures at the bottom of this Trail of Tears painting. She likes the diptych. And she often imposes on it either a native design of that specific region, or in this case, of course, the forced dispossession of her own ancestors from the southeast. And I often wonder, as a Haudenosaunee person, I mean, we live on greatly decreased land spaces, but we do have 8 reservations in this state. And I cannot imagine what it would be like to grow up across the continent in Oklahoma or somewhere else, and that's not where my people are from. So to be Native, but to grow up on someone else's territory, because Oklahoma was not empty when they moved all those people there. They just created more trouble between tribes. And so I've always been moved by this painting. And then in the more recent years, she started doing these ones where she would superimpose, as it were, over a landscape, not traditionally done in a la Church, but she's not trying to copy them. So a contemporary landscape painting, but with local designs from the people of that culture, right? Of the Orio Verde or any other culture, including one that's in this show here, the very famous Oxbow. I mean, if you take American art history in the US, this is 101, right? You learn first that that Cole invented landscape painting in the US. It's 101 thing, also not really true, but we'll let it go. He invents landscape painting, and then you are all tested on this painting, which you've been told, right, is the domesticated space of the East, the storm brewing over the wild wilderness of the West, and it has all this symbolic guga attached to it. And she kind of calls him out and places an Algonquin people, the Okamtuks, design, a design we know, alas, more archaeologically than we do from their contemporary culture. And she revives that and she puts that back on the land. She superimposes it and she asks the question, you know, it's a very blunt title. Tom, where are the Potomac? Because in his world, you just get painted out of it. There's no brutal death, there aren't battle scenes, it's not history painting. It's a post-history painting. And one has to ask what that's supposed to mean for Indigenous people. Another artist I chose is very different, but again, someone who's looking at landscape and looking at it from a very different perspective than someone like Walking Stick. And it's Teresa Baker. She is Mandan Hadassah. That's one of the 3 federated tribes with the Arikara up around Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota. And where she grew up, her father, Gerard Baker, a famous educator and historian for the National Park Service. And she said there was not a drive they could make in North Dakota with her dad that wasn't filled with history, lore. Every single inch of that place was not the empty plains that we see, but was a Mandan village on that waterway, or Arikara camps there, and there still find their teepee post holes, etc. It was a storied landscape, right? And it was very much a place. You often learn a lot when you're talking about these things in college, about the difference between space and place as a word. And space is kind of abstract and generic. It is a word much valued by real estate agents. Space. But it's not lived in, it's not known intimately, it's not storied, and that would be place. And she is interested, she said she grew up in a place that everyone looked at as space. That she was so sick of hearing flyover country when she talked about, you know. And this is almost like viewing from an airplane. If you fly over that country and you see that wonderful patchwork, weird as it is, of the upper plains, it does look like a quilt of sometimes forest, a lot of fields of different types, traversed by highways, right? And she does this over and over again in her work, and she loves to play, I think, somewhat humorously at times with materials like astroturf. Right? She paints on astroturf. Loves that, you know, kind of faux gesture at nature, but she often then weaves onto it pieces of, in this case, willow from the creek beds of the area where she grew up. And she rejects again, the Renaissance painter Alberti said that landscape should come as though you were looking out an idealized window, a rectilinear frame. And think of the frames of landscape paintings, and we're trying to train to see them in rectilinear frames. Our cameras do that for us. And here she's painting these highly abstracted landscapes she knows as place, because she's experienced them all her life. And not leaving them in that rectilinear form at all. They're kind of free form, the way they might look from a plane, that weird patch of land. Why is it shaped that way? Because not everything is straight lines out there. And she does this in a variety of media where she's talking about rivers and edges, stars, space, highways. And I find her work really engaging and kind of wonderfully honest. There'll be pieces of corn husk sewn into that work because those highways traverse, which were once the cornfields, the large cornfields of the Mandan people, who were not a horse nation, but were an agricultural people in sedentary villages, until really decimated, about 95% of their population wiped out in the early 19th century by disease, purely by disease. Right? And so you have those beautiful paintings of Mandan villages that Catlin did, when he's there in the 1830s. And of course, that same trip would have brought the pestilence that wipes them out 2 years later. And so there's the hidden story behind that of place that a lot of people don't really see at first. But if they start to think of who she is, where she's from, what you're saying mapping out the land means, you start to understand the stakes of these things. Another artist included in the show, and I'm kind of walking you around the show. I'm not going in chronological order, who's youngest to oldest, oldest to youngest, but how they're set up when you go into exhibit. So among those, see Kay's first, then you'll see. And this is by the late Ho-Chunk artist Truman Lowe, who was a wonderful sculptor, and I know from people that were his students, an amazing teacher as well. And his pieces have an elegance and ethereal quality like feather canoe, and I think of that like traveling the waterways of Wisconsin and the Great Lakes region in all its many waterways. Water spirit, that's just the most delicate sculpture, that's at Smith College. And the piece we have, the waterfall piece, which is a stunner. And part of what I love about it, here it's pictured next to Cole because it's placed next to the Cole painting in the exhibit, is yes, the splints mimic the waterfall, obviously, but again, it's also about place and landscape. He talks in his own writings about the many little waterfalls and rivulets that you had in the landscape he was in, and you know such little waterfalls and big ones from living here, and the little creeks that form waterfalls in the spring. And he loved those as a kid because he'd spent a lot of time with his parents who were out in the woods where these rivulets were and waterfalls, collecting black elm wood to be pounded into splints because his mother was a traditional basket maker. And so we just get the end product in a way, this wonderful representation of a waterfall, and it's dynamic because it slightly moves, it tremors in place, it's all kind of potential energy about to become kinetic. And all that is true of it. But there is also this backstory of spending time with his parents, wandering the woods with them as they collect these. And if you've ever seen splints be pounded, basketry is often a woman's traditional form, but the splints are usually provided by men. So it is, I always think of a very cooperative venture. My mother talks about the sound of splints being pounded when she was a child, and that rhythm as they go alternating, bump, 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 and they're pounding them. You pound them with the flat end of an axe, until they start to sheen off the plank. And it's, time consuming, it's a lot of effort, but it then will be turned into this beautiful art by the women who bring it inside, and in weaving it through, teach the children. She said she had one person on the reservation that used to pay the girls just to do the starter part of the bottom of the basket so she could have a bunch of them, but it meant that they were always in the room with her, and she was speaking Mohawk, and they were learning about stories, so it was a whole kind of education, cultural education around the 5 cents you got for your little piece, right? And I think that's part of all that work that I see when I look at a piece like that. Alan Michelson, right here. Wonderful fellow Mohawk and artist who's really a multimedia artist whose work I have enjoyed and watched over the last couple decades. A lot of attention to the degradation and changes of the land, and in his video pieces, and you see a beautiful one installed in the Cole house in the dark room in the back called Shadamuk, which is again, this was this is a waterway in New York City area. Chatham is part of the Hudson coming up, and he goes along in a kind of slow-moving boat and just films, and then edits and puts it to a score. And you just see, to think that we take this kind of as it is, these post-industrial blight, and we just don't ask ourselves, what was it before? And he projects it on this screen of feathers. And because Indians, we can't get away from feathers. Whether we want to or not, there's a famous moment when there was an artist in the turn of the century painting Western art, painting Navajo people, not wearing headdresses. And a critic says in the paper, I don't know how these are supposed to be Indians. No feather, no Indian. I said, who wants to be reduced to a feather, right? But that was no feather, no Indian. And so I love the kind of play on that, or this wall of feathers, and then have projected this modern terror on it. Chatham is then, so it's a night trip, and it's filmed with a spotlight going along some quite wild parts of, the riverbank, which may have looked that way hundreds of years ago, unchanged. But then you come to industrial parts, fancy residential parts. It's all, we all know the phases of the river, as we go up it. But I love that, again, with a beautiful score, contemplative, about a half-hour journey. And it's kind of like it's a journey through time, but it's not progressive in that way, because you realize these things all coexist. This isn't, it's not that easy. It's a complicated journey that leaves us in a complicated end position. It doesn't resolve anything for us, but it makes us aware of things we probably go by all the time and don't attend to. And I always think of that as very much in keeping with traditional Haudenosaunee teaching. One of our greatest kind of cultural traditions is the Thanksgiving address. And the terms for it in each of the Haudenosaunee language is the words that come before all else. Because it is literally the address you speak. It's not a prayer, it's an address that is recited by someone in their language at the beginning of all important meetings. And everyone says it a little differently, but everyone keeps the same order, right? That it is certain elements, the planets, the stars, the earth itself, the seas, and then you get into the weeds when it gets into the weeds, because then it's the medicine plants, the fruit plants, the berry plants. Some people are very specific in their taxonomy, so you're 45 minutes into thankfulness, and you're like, we're not even at the animals yet, it's going to get busy. And that's a wonderful moment, but what it does is it slows time down. And it is one of our favorite translated terms, mindfulness. And there's a mindfulness about this. I remember, thinking, we have to, the chiefs and the clan mothers do this at all meetings, and we do as a community at big events. Imagine if Congress had to say this every time it was about to vote on, I don't know, destroying the environment or something. Just a little mindfulness. That it could be a real, I think it's so valuable for us to keep those things alive, and I feel that in this art, which I always love. Another piece by Alan, which is again shown in this one in the new studio. I wanted a balance there of ancient representations of land by Haudenosaunee and other Native people, and then contemporary ones. And this is an ancient one, and it's from an early agreement we have with the Dutch on the Hudson River when they're planning to build a fort at where it's now Albany. So you have Fort Orange, Fort Nassau. Obviously, they could not have done that in our territorial headwaters without our agreement. It would have been impossible. They're not talking about where we're going to put 1,000 men here. no, we're going to leave a couple dozen men there. Well, they best have permission to stay there because they cannot defend themselves against a nation. And so this is one of our earliest so-called treaty belts. So a wampum belt, as you probably know, is made from these tubular beads that we call wampum. And they're a shell bead from either a white whelk shell or the purple inside of a quahog shell, right? And so they only come in purple and white. You don't have your choice of color right here. And these beads were made by coastal peoples. We did not make them. They were an object of trade, and they had an almost sacred significance to us because they're so durable. And you can put them in any pattern you want, mnemonic pattern of design, and then you memorize what that pattern signifies, and you pass that down from generation to generation, and that's your treaty. It's a kind of pre-writing or proto-writing, right, by mnemonic device. The Haudenosaunee flag, you may have seen, a chain with a pine tree shape in the middle. That's a famous wampum belt. So this belt we call Gaswenta, or the two-row wampum, as simple as it looks, is a very beautifully fleshed out concept of coexistence between Europeans and an indigenous group, in this case the Dutch and the Mohawks. And what it says, and why it's a landscape, is imagine the white beads are the Hudson River itself. And each one of the lines is the wake of a vessel, a native canoe and a European vessel, both going down the river. Both can be on it, both can share it by extension as a resource. And everything's good as long as you don't try to take over my canoe or I don't try to take over your vessel. If we recognize each other's mutual autonomy and share resources, there will not be conflict. We're not saying we alone on the river, but we alone on our path, you on your path. Please do not send a missionary to my canoe. Right? And we say that it's not that we don't want to contact you. We're always taught that they're not that far apart. They're only a handshake apart. There is communication. There could even be friendship. But there's not, well, now you're under our control. That's what there cannot be. And Alan Michelson does this wonderful project where he's at Akwesasne on the St. Lawrence River. And if you know that, that's my mother's reservation, and if you know that very complicated geopolitical space, it is a Mohawk reservation bisected by the US-Canadian border. So you could walk across the street and be in Canada. Right? That sounds nice enough. But when you're talking about two federal governments, a state government, the provincial government of Ontario, and the provincial government of Quebec, because they meet in our reservation, lucky us. So if you go to that, you live in that little corner that's Quebec, when you go to high school, since there are no high schools on the reservation, you have to go to a French-only high school. There's an ugly surprise, right? So it causes all sorts of consternation. And Alan wisely chooses, there's in the middle, in the middle of this is Cornwall Island, which is fully Mohawk controlled. It's, and so he's like, there's a third bank to the river. It's not just the Canadian side, the American side, but then there's this Mohawk side. It's as though there is a mysterious third line in this of autonomy, of hopeful mutual respect and representation, and respect for our sovereignty. I can tell you that doesn't happen a lot. But it's an idealized, both idealized and a kind of call to memory for us. The Churro is such a great promise of what that kind of living together could be. And the third bank calls the reality of it and the complications of it and the almost impossibility of it at times, because again, each federal government only recognizes one leadership from their side. So you end up having two reservation leaderships, which doesn't work. It's very much a divide and conquer mentality on the federal, and unnecessary complexity. And yeah, I love this piece just because it's both a familiar landscape, but the way it's inverted and then put within the context of the two-row makes it a very bittersweet piece to me, because I realize what's lost for us. Another piece that Alan did, this is a large kind of sculptural, earthwork sculptural piece outside of the Capitol building of Virginia in Richmond, is playing off of these designs, which you can't see here, I'm sorry, poor representation. This is 4 different hides of deer sewn together. It was a gift to British colonial leadership near the beginning of the Jamestown Project. It's come to be known as Powhatan's mantle. We don't actually think it was a worn cape or mantle, but rather probably a very abstract, like our representations of land, our abstract representation of the land itself, the territories, the place of Powhatan's rule, and all of the Confederate villages under his sway, right? That owed allegiance to him and mutual protection to each other. So these are all swirls. When you look at we have a facsimile of this in its actual size in the new gallery, and when you look at it, you'll see that it's just swirls of shell, and he took that same swirling design and put that in the landscape of the park behind the State House in Virginia for this tribute memorial to the original inhabitants of Virginia, the Pamunkey, Piscataway, etc., and called it Mantle. And I think it's that kind of reaching back. I love when artists reach back into Indigenous history and take out symbolic things, revive them in a way, because this you're not going to encounter unless you're in Oxford University at the Ashmolean Museum, where it has been since 1683. And they have said, I have talked to them, it's never going to travel. It's never going to travel. And it would be such a valuable thing in a way to bring it back here, not even to repatriate it. I have friends within the community that say, it's a gift, but we would love to see it. We would love, because it was a gift that was meant to show our sovereignty and our concept of ourselves as a united people in this confederacy. And it's been alienated so long from us, and our situation has changed so much from what it was when Powhatan was able to present it, that it would be a real joy to have it back just for a visit, right? But I'm not going to hold my breath, let's say. But I think these are such examples, to me, are such powerful examples of what I wanted to see come together in a dynamic discussion with landscape painting. And I hope it is that. Brandon Lazar is an Onondaga citizen from the Snipe clan, who's a painter, artist, and really is someone who plays with very traditional design work and motifs, like the sky dome. And you'll see this sky dome from the right along the lintel over the, going halfway around the room in the new gallery. And this was commissioned of him for this exhibit, but the sky dome itself is an ancient ancestral design. Here you have Caroline Parker's 19th century beadwork using the same motif, and there's no one way to do it. It's just like, kind of like the Thanksgiving address, certain elements must be there. but everyone can have their own take on it. And then, so the sky dome is technically a cosmology in representation. You have the sky world, which is above the dome. That's a idealized world of heavenly figures. And then you have our world beneath the great dome of the sky. And in our creation story, some of you may know, there's a sky woman, and she's pregnant, and a large tree on the sky dome falls over, and there's a hole, and she peers through it, and falls through space, and is wafted safely down by Canadian geese in a ring, and she lands on the back of an enormous turtle, which Turtle Island, North America. But it's no place to live because it's the back of a turtle. So all the animals that are around compete to bring dirt from the bottom of the water up to the turtle's back. And the humble muskrat wins the day and is the savior and puts soil on the back of the turtle. She brought seeds with her of sacred plants, like tobacco among them, and the three sisters, and things start to grow. And our whole creation story comes out of that. And our relational responsibilities to that world. And so in this version that Brandon did, we have the sky dome, and then we have the three sister plants, squash, corn, and beans. And as I've mentioned before, and many of you may know this, one of the types of agriculture the Haudenosaunee and other Native people practiced, we call intercropping. You grow all the things together, right, in a circle. And then the good old Puritans came here and said that those should be straight lines, and we don't want those plants mingling, heaven forbid. So monocropping, we want monocropping. Monocropping is brutal on the soil because it leaches it of its nutrients. And what Native people knew through keen observation, not the science, they weren't testing things in a lab, but from an everyday observational point, recognized that these three sustaining plants had a symbiotic relationship with each other. Corn requires a lot of nitrates to grow and have a big, bountiful corn cob, and it leaches it from the soil in a dangerous way and depletes it. Beans want something to climb, to spread out, and they can climb the corn stalk. And beans naturally have the ability as a plant to pull nitrates out of the air and put them in the soil. What better buddies could there be? And then squash, because of its low-lying leaves, has a lot of, because it is a ground plant, has a lot of natural toxins against insects in it. And its leaves keep moisture on the bed. So you plant them all together, you have this the squash protecting the ground, you have the corn growing straight and tall because of the nitrates being fixed in it by the beans, and they're all long-term plants, meaning they may be annuals, but their fruit or vegetable you can save for months. You know, squash, dried beans, dried corn. They were the sustaining, they are the three sisters. And they're in that sky dome because they are such a precious part of creation. Under it, the band he's put under it represents a wampum belt, those triangles, which we would read vertically. So if you hung it end to end, the points going up, and that's called the ever-growing pine, right? And the pine tree, which is the symbol of the tree of peace, that's what the peacemaker makes us bury our weapons under, hence bury the hatchet. At the beginning of the great code of peace, that tree, we say, could grow on forever if every new group accepts this code of peace, the Skanangoa, the great peace. And so it will go as far as it can, right? It will keep. We were once 5 nations, then we became the 6th nation when the Tuscarora joined our league. And we could grow ever more. And so Brandon has placed that as the basis of his version of the sky dome. And then you have the mountains, the 3 mountains. They're just symbols, again, of the hillside, the countryside. And someone was saying they like that they're not jagged, they're like our mountains. they show this is our place. But again, it's such a simple thing in a certain way, but it is so heavy with significance and teaching. You know, many Native people recognize that the landscape and its stories teach us how to live on it. There's a great book by an anthropologist named Keith Basso, passed away, called Wisdom Sits in Places. And it's about Apache territory, but it talks about how all the stories on their landscape of their traditional homeland are stories that tell you how to live there, how to survive there, how to flourish there. They're not simply, oh, and this is a story about a person that ran from a giant and turned to a stone, and that's why we have this. There are some stories like that, but he pushes them deeper to find their ethic, and it's in there. So I love that about them too. This is painting by Brandon of some 21 of our historic wampum belts. He's swirled them together. I mean, I just love it because it's like a kind of fantasia of all the wampum belts one would try to learn the meaning of. Growing up, it's part of his aesthetic. He also paints. I like that there's kind of a Jugendstil versus native thing going on with this. This one's at the State Museum in Albany now. It has a pendant painting of a male smoke dancer as well. And Syracuse owns a version of the Man of Two Worlds, his Vitruvian Haudenosaunee man. But I love these riffs on these other traditions as well, you know, that can incorporate things that are meaningful to us, play on visual language that we also know, and hopefully create what I'm trying for in this curated exhibit as a dynamic conversation between these things that are so often put apart from each other. So thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, Scott will take a few questions, and then the whole place will be open for everyone to go and see. So,
Yes.
Clarify one more time why the pine tree is such an important symbol. You say it's the symbol of peace. And
Right. So when the peacemaker came to the Five Nations, so the Oneida, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. Back in that time, though we had mutual linguistic traditions and beliefs, we were at war all the time as neighbors. And he came with a new message that wasn't about whoever's strongest rules all, but it was about a lasting peace. And that it will make you stronger together. And he takes the white pine, and the white pine has 5 needles that come out of one place in each thing. And he says, think of each one of those needles as one of you. And think how skinny and weak this tree would be if it just had one needle in each place, not those 5 bound together, right? And think of a thing, a bunch of arrows. One arrow you can break easily, 5 bound together, hard to break. And this notion of the pine tree was the first symbol he uses as a teaching symbol. And then there is a huge pine tree, and he causes it to turn over and expose its roots. And he says those 4 great white roots are the white roots of peace, and they go in every direction, north, south, east, and west. But if you'll place all your weapons under it and rewrite the tree and let it stand for lasting peace between us, that will become our symbol, the tree of peace. Right? And that is at the center of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's flag, which is purple and white. And it looks like 4 squares, but they're kind of like chained together. And in the middle, a diamond-shaped tree, which is the pine tree, the peace tree. And that's the enduring thing. So there have been various political activists in the 20th century, like Chief Smoke, that went around planting peace trees at different places, like at the International Peace Court at The Hague, there's one that he planted, and also at the United Nations, several college campuses, etc. And yeah, it's just a symbol that represents our concept of that moment of coming together.
Who was the peacemaker?
Peacemaker is we don't say his name. I mean, he has a name, but it's not usually spoken. And he is the one who comes with Ayunwata, who gets turned into Hiawatha in English. And he's sent by the Great Spirit to bring peace to the Haudenosaunee and bring them into league. So he comes across the water, probably Huron, and has this Mohawk helper, Hiawatha, who helps him speak to the people. And he teaches them this great code of peace. And there's a recitation of the Great Code annually that takes several days, all the parts of it. And it's not like a legalistic thing, but it's all the things you must be mindful of that bring peace together. So it's not like you can't eat that, but you can eat that, and you can't do this. It's not legalistic in that way. It's more about all the things that we must be mindful of in order to be at peace. And you know, they're kind of miraculous. He comes on a stone canoe. I haven't seen a lot of those. And he's opposed by a figure named Agudao, who's a warlord, quasi-sorcerer figure among the Onondaga. And so he goes, he's made peace, he's got the message of peace across to 4 of the 5 nations, but the central nation, right in the midst of them geographically, is Onondaga, and they're ruled by this warlord. And everyone's afraid to talk to him. And he's always depicted as being of such an evil mind that he has snakes in his hair. Never a good sign. And so, you know, metaphorically or not, he has snakes in his hair, and no one wants to approach him. And then a woman, Jigonsase, says, "I can talk to him." And she does, and he finally assents to let the snakes be combed from his hair, metaphorically, so that he can understand the words of peace, and allows the Onondaga to join, and they become the final piece of the puzzle, as it were. And to honor that, that's why our council fire is at Onondaga, right? That's where we would all go. And the head, the kind of, not the most powerful, but the person we select as the most honored position to represent the Confederacy, still called the Tadadaho, and that's a person who represents that old figure in the past who converted to the cause of peace. And that's who's the titular head of the Confederacy. But he's chosen, but he's not a ruler. He's a representative of us. And so that's Sid Hill right now, and so he would represent us at things like the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Relations at the UN and things like that. Yeah.
Living right near here
Mm-hmm.
and being influenced obviously by Cole. My understanding is that by the time Cole was painting, what he was painting didn't exist very much anymore. There was a kind of ecological disaster happening up in the mountains. They were being stripped out. He was really trying to paint a testimony or a memorial to what had been. Can we view the indigenous people in the painting as part of that? Because by the time he was painting, my understanding is there were very few indigenous people left in the area.
Yeah, there would have been a few communities left. There would have been some families, indeed. Remember, he's painting right around the time of a national policy of Indian removal. I mean, that's what it's called, right? The Indian Removal Act. I always tell my students, there's no trying to hide it. 1830, Congress votes on the Indian Removal Act that says all Native people east of the Mississippi must be moved west of the Mississippi. It only passes by 5 votes. And It is the South that primarily wants it. The North has removed many of its native people, so they're not particularly bothered by it. But for the South, it will be a huge land grab for slavery, for the extension of slavery. All those lands, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, that will open up what becomes Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas. And that will extend slavery right to the Civil War. And so Indian removal is very much a topic of the day. It's not like he's odd in that he thinks about it. It's in the newspaper all the time. And it's very much, the groups that fought it in the North were abolitionists, not so much because they particularly felt sympathy for Native people, though they may have, but because they realized this is a land grab for slavery. And we let this go through, slavery will treble in size. And so he's aware of I mean, this is a national conversation, and he's by no means alone in what he's doing with these solitary Native figures. I guess it's memorial's one way of saying it. Elegiac was the term I used, but it amounts to the same thing as the kind of honoring a passing of a people. But there's a scholar named Renato Rizaldo who coined the term imperial nostalgia. And he said that's when you really work very hard to destroy another people, and then when you have, you feel bad about it and memorialize them. So they're gone, we got rid of them, but we did name this highway after. You know, and I just think, not enough. And so there is a lot of that weird imperial nostalgia in that, like, I'm savoring my goodbye to the Native people. In terms of the ecological part, I mean, he is someone that he very much hated seeing the uglification of the world around him through the railroads, tanneries, businesses that were heavy-duty pollutants. Extractive industry is brutal, and he recognized. I mean, I was talking to someone just yesterday about old pictures of regions like here, or I used to live in New Hampshire. Old pictures of New Hampshire, what I considered like must be virgin forest, and you see it in 1880, and it is clipped to the bone. And you realize, oh, that forest has only been here for the last 80 years. And so he was looking at a devastation coming to the landscape. I think when he starts painting, he's painting what he sees, and to a large extent, we know, say with Catterskill Falls, even by the time he's painting, there's a viewing platform there. And he doesn't want that, so he paints it out. And that's why I say don't ever take them as documentary proof of anything, because people change mountains, they get rid of ugly buildings, they put in things they want to see, etc. But he's very much of a moment in American history, and I think that sometimes gets lost in the artistic talk, because people don't want to politicize art, and I'm like, it's already doing that. Like, don't worry about that. Thank you, though.
All right, thank you all for coming, and join us. There'll be a tent outside. You can have something to drink and eat, and you can enter. All the buildings will be open, but of course, food and drink don't go inside the historic buildings. But otherwise, yeah, so thank you all. Enjoy.
Thank you.